Peruvian cabinet and what that might mean. He finished off his little stint to me telling me that he lives off-grid and he does Zumba. So don't worry about the Zumba, Alexis, but...
He's a great dancer too.
Yeah, sorry, one of my great favourites. Thank you.
Alexis, I just want to clip this onto you. It's just for the video recording.
Right.
Thank you. Oops, I'll do it up here, I think. Thank you.
So we can start this presentation, will it all work? So I guess we've certainly got to start by saying that I'm speaking in a personal capacity, and any views expressed do not reflect the opinions of my employer or any other organisation. So just bear that in mind, because it was certainly, not now, we've got to launch the presentation. And from the beginning, okay. So Dr. Alexis Wadsley, so economist by training. When I did my PhD, I was looking at macroeconomics in the terms of trade and what happens when iron ore prices go up and down, and whether we should have a sovereign wealth fund and things like that. So not related to what we're talking about. But in terms of the economics and the SOE, saying like, what is the economic problem? And this is sort of bringing it back to your college or your first year, and really saying like, how are we going to meet the needs of all people within the ecological limit? So what do we produce? How do we produce it? And then who gets what is produced? And I guess when we look at the State Environment Report, that is a how do we produce it? Can we produce it more sustainably? But we also have to ask ourselves a question about what are we producing? Is that what we need? And probably one of the best frameworks to try to sort of understand or answer that question today, trying to say maybe we should be moving beyond neoliberal economic models and global financial crisis and all those areas where it's led us astray, and looking at the donut economics. Now, the principle of donut economics is that we've got the ecological limits around the outside. No, that is where we're pushing against it. And I'm just following the theme here. The spelling is terrible, but that's AI. So I don't think we really have to worry about stealing our jobs straight away. So the outer limit is impeding upon sort of the economic limits, and that's sort of really where that State of the Environment Report sits, and saying like, how far are we pushing beyond the limits of what we have available? When are we going to create the crisis? The hole in the middle represents the inequality, the fact that not everybody is getting the minimum sort of quality of life that they need, and whether we look at sort of core physical things like housing, where clearly there's a shortage of those people who need it, but there's going to be other aspects of health, education, support, sense of well-being, good healthy nutrition, etc. So all those areas, that's the whole. And so the concept of donut economics is one where you try to fill in the hole, that is, get a better distribution of the goods that we need for the community, but also operating within the outer limits of what we have, and that is really where the State of the Environment Report sits in defining what those limits are and how well is Tasmania as a very well-defined, discrete population and locality defined. And so being an economist, I then say, okay, how do we position it? How do we score ourselves? Where can we then go and set goals? So saying, look, so we're going to say, where do you go into policy? You've got to try and say, what are we trying to achieve? Because most humans coordinate well when we've got an objective, and we all agree what the objective is, and then we try and work out how we're going to get there. And then what are the trade-offs that we've got to make? What are the hard decisions? So we can say, yes, we're not going to do this, we're going to do that, or where do we move from one thing to the other? This vertical axis, this really is that sort of classical economic goals. And we can define it in terms of GDP, as we traditionally have, and our leaders traditionally said we're going to get economic growth. Now I think we can be a little bit more nuanced. I think we'd just say, well, actually a better way of defining our economic goals is really all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. That is, we're bringing in more of those less market-driven, more equity-driven concepts, and saying that we really want to achieve all of the UN development goals in order to say that, yes, we're successful. And a society like Tasmania, in Australia broadly, should be able to achieve that. We do have the wealth. We do have the resources, we do have the human capital and the systems to be able to do that. So there's really no excuse for us not to be able to achieve all of the 17 UN development goals. Then the question is, can we do it within the economic limits, the environmental limits that we have? And so our second objective here is operate within Earth's limits. And we can see that in terms of where societies sit, we've got those which are undeveloped property. Maybe they do have capacity to utilise their environment more, but they've got a long way to go in terms of achieving the human aspects of a good life. We get a pathway to overdeveloped environmental catastrophe, which seems to be the pathway that we're on at the moment, where we're just heading out this way, don't care about the environmental limits, just get growth at all cases. But even then, it's not really good growth because it doesn't have the equity components that we're looking at. So really what we need to do is start turning the corner here and saying, actually, we want to be living in a point of eudaimonia, at the point which is where we are operating within the environmental constraints, and we've got a sustainable, equitable quality of life for everybody. And you think that is our economic goals. We want to be aiming at this point, and currently we're heading somewhere over here. And where does the State of the Environment report sit? It's telling us how far are we beyond what it might be a sustainable point. So we really want to be able to be looking at all of the aspects of our scorecard and saying, how do we bring them in while still moving us towards our sort of economic or social goal of achieving each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Or if you're going to be really, really simplistic, you'd be talking about GDP per capita or GDP. But we're not, obviously we want to move beyond that because we're showing that it's got huge gaps in areas like housing. So, where are we? State of the economy. Strong population growth, or certainly was leading up into the COVID crisis. So we got a big census surprise coming through when so it turns out there was sort of 30,000 more Tasmanians than we thought we had. We thought we had growth, and actually we dipped up probably a lot of sort of education and international student elements of that, and then that forming into a migration pathway. 4.2% unemployment. Now that basically is close to full employment. I think if you look at by age cohort, and that's probably one of the useful ways of looking at unemployment, because you get very different patterns by age. We've still got a youth unemployment. We're sitting in that 10 to 20%. But once you get into the 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, it's getting down to 2 to 4%. And when you're in that sort of range, it's really the how well are you going matching people to their jobs. So we've got higher interest rates, which are putting a lot of households under pressure. We get, so that's coming out of the cost of living increase that we've had. We've got an ironic response from the Reserve Bank where we've had a increase in the cost of living, so they've raised another element of the cost of living, and assuming that's going to fix it. And I think that's the issue about whether we've got a supply side problem or a demand side problem. They're treating it as a demand side problem. Key challenge is still housing. Where once again you'd be saying, well, hang on, we've got an issue of a supply of housing, so we're going to increase the cost of the supply of housing, which is, once again, not necessarily intuitive from an economic perspective. From the Tasmanian economy, international export's still strong, but important for this context is its focus on minerals and metals and agri-food products, largely to Asia. So Tasmania has got a strong export base, a strong export economy, but a lot of that is sitting in traditional areas. So we're talking about our mines and the ores that come from those. We're talking about importing ores from overseas, processing them into metal, and then shipping them overseas. And then we've got the agricultural food products, including salmon. And you go, what's another way of looking at the Tasmanian economy? And I sort of, this way is showing you actually what is the genuine shape of the Tasmanian economy from both an industry perspective and an employment perspective. So it's our two key aspects. The vertical axis here is productivity. So what is the GDP per worker? It's looking at all workers, so not a full-time equivalent measure. And the sector of the far left there, ICT, so that's our highest productivity per worker. But because I've got all the workers along the bottom axis, the size there, the size of that cube is the size of that sector to the economy. So ICT, yep, really high productivity, not employing a lot of people. So not really a significant part of the economy. Finance, once again, like high productivity, not employing a lot of people in Tasmania. And that sort of marks the difference between the Tasmanian economy and, say, Sydney or Melbourne. They've got larger ICT, larger finance sectors, they're those high productivity sectors, and they form a more important part of their economy overall. But then we get to Tasmania, and what are our two high productivity sectors that are not ICT and finance? Well, it's mining and agriculture. So from a Tasmania and sort of maintaining that balance between economy and environment perspective, our two large sectors that are high productivity are sort of in those sort of environmentally sensitive sectors. And that's obviously going to create a challenge for any politician who's looking at how they trade that off, because we need to maintain the sort of the output from those sectors, the productivity of those sectors, in order to support the Tasmanian economy overall. Going across sort of electricity, gas, and water infrastructure. So Tas Water, as we heard earlier. But that's also the area where we're expecting to have the growth in terms of some of those energy assets. But at the moment, not actually a significant part of the Tasmanian economy from either a productivity or total number of employment perspective. Going on, the big ones: construction, healthcare, and social assistance. So very large parts of the economy. So healthcare and social assistance is the largest sector of our economy in terms of what do we produce. So if you say, what does Tasmania produce? We produce health and social care, aged care and all those sort of services. So that's really what we do. And that would also include sort of childcare as well in that sector. So that's really what we do, is caring for each other. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's important to remember that a lot of the money that comes for that is coming from overseas. Sorry, overseas, that is the mainland. It's coming through in terms of our GST distribution and so forth. So the circular flows in the Tasmanian economy are interesting from that perspective. Go through manufacturing, so a significant sector in Tasmania, so we still manufacture things, but actually not outperforming from a productivity perspective, not actually a huge employer, but it's still an important component of the economy. Then education, once again, so not actually that high productivity from this measure. Now, a lot of that is going to be driven by the wages. So when you're talking about these sectors, when it's government, the way it's accounted for is what are you paying for that product, that's how much it's worth. So that is not necessarily capturing the true value of education. It is capturing how much did we invest in it because it's a government delivered service. And then we get down to the bottom end, we've got retail and accommodation and food services. So in terms of the Tasmanian economy, they are our lowest productivity sectors. So if you're going to try and grow your economy, and as I mentioned earlier, we've got close to full employment, we can't necessarily try and grow tourism because where are the workers going to come from? So these sectors are important if they're bringing people into the economy who wouldn't otherwise be working and they're looking for work. So then that's an important step. So part of a conveyor belt, but in terms of providing the economic wealth to raise our standards of living, not really an important sector. They're important way of bringing people into the workforce. If you're going to have to be transferring anybody out of these other sectors into those sectors, that's going to be a net loss from an economic perspective. So where are we going to go from that? That is the sort of the challenge that our sort of politicians and economic masters face, where they're saying, how do we shape, where do we invest in order to be able to grow the overall economy? Which is then going to provide the goods and services that we want to get that quality of life. So, state of the budget. Caveat already mentioned, I'm not speaking on behalf of any particular part of the government. State of the budget, so first off, modern monetary theory does not apply to Tasmania. So environmental economists, they'll look at it and say, that's great, we can solve all these problems, money isn't an issue. Does not apply to Tasmania. Tasmania cannot print money. Second one is, there is still a constraint even in modern monetary theory, that is, how many workers do you have? As I said earlier, we are close to full employment. We can see those people are working. So if we're trying to say we've got a magic bullet in modern monetary theory, no, we don't. We're still facing the same challenges. It is just a question about how do we allocate the people that we've got, which really is our budget. Our budget is people, not dollars at this point. How do we allocate them in order to be able to achieve the goals that we want in terms of housing, services, etc. Then we can look at the money side of things, which it seems that the government is not taking that seriously in terms of where those ones and zeros are going. Because, and say, take the SOE report to say, we're sort of operating beyond our long-term budget constraint. We cannot keep going on this trajectory and pay all our bills. However, we know at some point it's going to change. It's not we are nowhere near Greece or any other sort of really basket case sort of financial situation. But the track we're on is not one that is ultimately sustainable. We will need to change at some point. So we've got a cumulative net operating balance deficit of 1.7 billion over the next 4 years. So that's quite big. We're going to have accumulated net debt of 8.6 billion in 27-28. And that's sort of more than doubled over the last 4 years. So there was a rapid increase in debt. The difference between those numbers is also going to be how much money we're spending on infrastructure. So we're putting a lot of investment into building roads, bridges, all of that kind of stuff. Also, improving the hospitals, capital, and so forth. But we've also got a lot of pressure to spend more on health and education. Said they're important parts of our economy, important parts of what the government is spending money on. A lot of people say, including Salt Lake, that we're not necessarily spending enough on that, on those services relative to other jurisdictions. But we're already sort of living beyond our means from a fiscal perspective. So a lot of challenge in that space. the budget constraint is probably not really there in terms of the dollars at this point, or as the government's not operating in that way, but it is still absolutely there in terms of where are the people going to come from. And of course, we can't necessarily bring people from the mainland or anywhere else because we don't have the housing pool. So it's so it's still a constraint. Would we be remiss to actually sort of not look at the energy transition? So an important part from a government perspective, because we are the owner of those businesses. A lot of questions about which is the direction that Tasmania is going to take in terms of engaging in the overall energy transition. Some of those questions about what is the most economically efficient, environmentally efficient, sustainable way of actually investing there. But from a budget perspective, 11.1 billion of investment across the state sector. So it's a really important part of, we are pouring a lot of dollars into that in order to then generate sort of a future direction, hopefully economic growth, and it is a source of good jobs. So look, while the electricity sector is not a major part of the Tasmanian economy in terms of that number of workers times productivity, it is a better job than say down in the tourism sector. So an important place to go, but a lot of big questions still out there, and obviously with the government is working on a business case at this point for Marinus Link. And finally, it'd be remiss not to try and say, well, what does the result that happened last Tuesday mean from an economic perspective? How do we interpret that? Because it's critical that we understand, if we don't understand what's happening or why that result happens, how do we know how we can translate issues like the State of the Environment Report into something which is going to be effective policy? So what would the lessons I take this, and class is the is what I say. This is why the Democrats failed. But they've got the Democrats had a more sustainable sort of set of policies in place, and Trump's message was drill baby drill. Drill baby drill won fairly convincingly at the ballot box, and that's got to be a concern for anybody who is interested in how do we move on to that sustainable path. So we've got to understand it. So obviously there's an obsession of a liberal elite, overregulation, bureaucratisation, and we've seen in terms of the establishment of the new administration, a lot of focus on that deregulation side of things. Pretty much indifference on the part of the majority of the electorate to the progressive woke issues, including tenant integrity concern, and fairly indifferent to environmental concerns. But what they are receptive to is simple framing of arguments, so three-word slogans, but also tangible three-word slogans. So drill baby drill work better than opportunity economy, whatever that means. How to interpret this economically is in terms of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So we're saying that people have got various levels that they need to be safe, physiologically, safety, have social networks, esteem before they start appreciating high values. So unless people are feeling secure in their jobs that they can pay for their groceries, they are not going to be concerned about woke issues or the environment or possibly even the integrity of the candidates they're voting for. They say, I need to meet this base first. So we need to take that into account if we're going to frame a set of policies that is going to resonate to get the support. So I think another way of looking at this also is a behavioural cognitive budget. So if we're sitting here with fairly comfortable lives, good food, good nutrition, good amount of sleep, we can understand complex concepts, we can bring them on board, we've had the education, we're comfortable with that. But many of the people that are out there voting do not have that luxury. And therefore they simply do not have the mental energy to be able to absorb complex concepts. They're looking for something that is simple that they can understand, and what do they do? And so their budget to process complex information is very, very low, and therefore we need to make it simple for them. And that sort of comes on behalf of any policy maker to say how do we make people understand what they need to do, and say what are their priorities. But that's it from an economic perspective. But I hope that assists. But happy to take any questions unless I'm over time.
Given that we are a little bit late, we do have a full program. If we could hold questions off for Alexis, and we'll jump straight into the next speaker. So while we do a switcheroo with the microphones, we actually have two ways of recording it. So
just going to clip this onto you.
I'll tell you about Jason.
Thank you. Actually, there is fine.
Jason is Professor of Human Geography and Planning at the University of Tasmania. His research focus has been on green space, climate change, adaptation and environmental justice, what an interesting concept that is. He's been busy with 100 scholarly scholarly publications. Given that he's not an old man, that's a lot of work.